And so adoption and US immigration policy is also an important thing to discuss when thinking about adoption as a form of migration. The first thing is that in the mid 20th century, when the first wave of Korean adoptees were brought to the US, there were actually Asian exclusion acts in place. So these were immigration policies that either banned or heavily restricted immigration from Asian countries. These were in effect through the 1960s. However, these did not apply to adoptees. Citizenship overall is usually relatively easy for adoptees to gain compared to other forms of immigration. This is because adoptees are adopted at a pretty young age, and then also are sponsored by US citizens. So this means that there's this belief that the adoptees do not pose any kind of political or cultural threat to the status quo of the United States, because they're being raised by US citizens and are going to be raised in what are considered to be much more traditionally American households. And then in 2000, there's an act called the Child Citizenship Act, or the Adoptee Citizenship Act, and this made it even easier for adoptees to gain citizenship. Before 2000, adoptees had to be naturalized within the United States after they were adopted, or their parents had to get them naturalized. However, the Adoptee Citizenship Act allowed it so that naturalization process, gaining citizenship, was part of the adoption process already. So it really expedited that experience for adoptees. Much of this was done because adoptees are not usually viewed as traditional immigrants. This is mostly because, again, they're adopted at a young age and raised in white households, so they don't have many ties to either their birth country or other immigrant communities in the United States here. And what this really ends up doing is it goes back to the idea of adoptees as these exceptional exceptions that they never asked to be. This idea that they're easily assimilable, they're non-threatening, and therefore this immigration policy constructs adoptees as these kind of de-racialized members of American families, rather than these racialized threats, which are usually used to frame immigrants as threatening or, quote, illegal aliens. And then adoption thus exposes this very assimilationist model of citizenship law, whereby one can gain citizenship by proving that they can conform to the status quo of the United States, rather than bringing in their own culture, their own history, and their own politics along with them. And then the final thing I want to note with immigration policy is just that the Child Citizenship Act of 2000 did have a loophole in that it did not provide retroactive citizenship for adoptees who were adopted prior to 2000. So if an adoptee was adopted prior to 2000, it was on their parents to get them naturalized before they turned 18. So this has become a problem because some adult adoptees never knew that they weren't naturalized as citizens, because their parents didn't see them as immigrants, therefore never really thought about having to get that documentation for them. So that means if an adult adoptee who was never naturalized has any kind of run-in with the law, whether it's a drunk driving case or anything like that, they then found out that they were actually undocumented and then have been deported back. So adoption and transnational migration. The interesting thing about adoption is that it disrupts a lot of understandings about what transnationalism and immigration or migration really mean. When we think about migration in terms of the more traditional sense, oftentimes we hear about people who migrate or move to a different country in order to have build a better life for themselves, or maybe be with family or loved ones, or to find community elsewhere. We also, of course, hear about those who are fleeing war or fleeing other types of violences or persecution in their own home countries. For adoptees, it's a little different, where adoptees do not elect to migrate. They do not elect to come to the United States and be raised here or wherever they end up. Adoptee migration is a type of forced migration. That doesn't mean that the adoptive parents are forcibly removing them out of some kind of hatred for them or any kind of malicious intent. However, it is still a forced migration in that adoptees do not have any choice in the matter. And their biological parents do not have any choice. Oftentimes when a biological parent abroad is giving a child up for adoption, they don't always know that that child is likely going to be sent out of the country. Adoptee migration is also a little different because, again, adoptee citizenship is privileged over other forms of citizenship. So it doesn't fall into that traditional narrative of having to take like citizenship tests and have screenings and that kind of thing. All of that is done either through the process of adoption, if it's after 2000, or those screenings are done by the adoptive parents on the adoptee's behalf. So the question that this asks a lot is, are adoptees immigrants? Obviously, in the most rudimentary sense of the term, yes, they are immigrants. They're naturalized in the United States or other countries, and they are born elsewhere. However, again, adoptees do not fit these very traditional understandings of immigration. When we discuss the experience of immigrants, we talk about cultural assimilation, the process of adjusting to a different culture, perhaps having to learn a different language when one moves, learn a different system of parenting, of schooling, or something like that. Adoptees don't have that because, again, they're adopted generally at a very young age and oftentimes adopted into families that have very little connection or understanding of the adoptee's birth culture. And so the adoptee is generally raised in a white household and therefore usually raised within the dominant culture of the United States. So adoptees don't have to work as hard to adjust culturally because they are already being raised with those values and with those cultural practices. Another thing that we hear a lot when we talk about immigration and migration is the formation of migrant communities within receiving countries for migrants. Adoptees, again, those especially that are adopted into white households, are often very removed from those communities and so do not have much interaction with other immigrant communities, especially immigrant communities that are from the same country as them. So there's not a ton of ties to people from their homeland, to the cultures, again, the food, the language of their homeland. And so that's another way in which adoptee immigration and their adoptees' experiences as immigrants is very different than more mainstream understandings of what an immigrant experiences or what they go through. And this all, again, ties back to this exceptionalism of adoptees. Again, this idea that there are good and bad immigrants out there is very prevalent for adoptees, and adoptees are seen, if they are seen as immigrants, they're seen as the good immigrants, the ones, again, that aren't going to pose any kind of political or cultural threat to the United States or to the status quo. They are going to be instead acculturated and assimilated into the existing culture of the United States, and therefore are often used as examples of what, again, this ideal good immigrant is going to look like, one that's easily assimilable and isn't going to fight back against any kind of repressive policies here. So with culture and community, it's also an interesting topic for adoption, and also one that adoptees oftentimes disrupt just due to the nature of adoption being this very non-normative process and a form of family making. So as I said before, adoptees often lack a ton of ties to their country of birth, if any. When an adoptive parent relinquishes their child for adoption, they often are also relinquishing all of their rights to that child, so rights to contact that child or anything like that. Sometimes they're doing this without actually knowing that that's what the deal is or that's what's happening. But it really depends. Again, like I said earlier, the experiences of adoption, adoptive parents, and birth parents are going to be different no matter what and across every individual experience. But generally speaking, transnational adoptees do not have any familial, legal, or social ties to their country of birth. This is, becomes more and more common the younger the adoptee is at their time of birth. And so this means that unlike, again, other narratives of immigration, adoptees do not send remittances, send money back to any family members back in their country of birth. They also are not in contact with people back there. So that community that is established in one's homeland does not exist for adoptees. And so that's another way that adoptees differ a lot from the traditional understanding of immigration. A second one is also, again, this cultural authenticity. Like I said before, adoptees are also usually removed from other immigrant communities and other communities of color as well. And so that means that any exposure to an adoptee's birth culture, or even what it might mean to be Asian, Asian American, or any race really, is something that a lot of adoptees don't feel like they have a full grasp on. So when adoptees want to engage with their birth culture, if they want to really try and connect with maybe their Chinese side, for example, a lot of adoptees feel like they're being inauthentic when they do that because they don't actually have other people in their community, in their close social circle, who can teach them how to do that. It's something where adoptees feel very self-conscious for having to, for example, look up a Chinese recipe online rather than have that passed down through their family. The final thing is also with regards to race. So transracial adoptees, again, that's adoptees who are persons of color and adopted into white households, or at least that's generally what people are referring to when they say that. Transracial adoptees are often removed from other communities of color and raised in predominantly white communities. So again, not only do they feel removed oftentimes from their birth culture, but then also feel like they don't really have a full understanding of what it means to be Asian, Asian American, etc.